Welcome to the Journal Editorial Report. I'm David Asman in this week for Paul Gigot. We start with this week's rollout of the Trump Tax Plan, and not a moment too soon, with the U.S. economy growing just 0.7% in the first quarter of the year. Joining the panel this week, Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger, Washington columnist Kim Strassel, editorial board member Joe Rago, and assistant editorial page editor James Freeman. Well, Joe, let's talk about the tax plan, because even though the press says there's not much to it, there's a lot to it. The details that were laid out on Wednesday: business taxes for large and small companies cut down to 15%. They're going to level the playing field between a big and a small by getting rid of a lot of the special deductions. A one-time tax to bring back $2 to $3 trillion in capital from overseas. Very simplified individual tax rates from 7 brackets down to 3. Lowering of the top marginal rate. Getting rid of the death tax and alternative minimum tax. Reduction of capital gains. It goes on and on. There are a lot of specifics in here.
Yeah, this is really an exercise in growth economics, and that the reforms you're talking about are immediate, permanent, and deep enough to improve the incentives to work and invest. This is a plan really designed to get us out of the 1 to 2% growth rut that we've been in for so long, which is why wages aren't rising, businesses aren't investing, and standards of living aren't going up.
And Dan, the fact is that we've tried this before, and most notably during the Reagan years. The tax cuts during the Reagan years did not really kick in until 1983. And if you look at a chart of the growth rate from 1981 until the end of the Reagan administration, look at what happened. In 1983, we went from a recession, negative 1.9 to 4.6%. Then in 84, we grew 7.3%. And from then on, it was no lower than 3.5%.
Yeah, and so we have to ask ourselves, how did it happen? It isn't just magic, though there is perhaps a tax policy that is built on magic. What Reagan did and what the Trump plan is trying to do is what we call a supply-side tax reform, as against the demand side, which is what basically Barack Obama did with his stimulus, which is you drop a lot of money into the economy, you give it to people, they spend it, the economy grows. We tried that for 8 years with 0% interest rates. It didn't work. This one is trying to liberate capital, put money in the hands of the producers. That lower corporate rate of 15% is going to apply as well to small and medium-sized businesses. And once that capital is retained by them, the idea is that they then will go out, invest it, and create more jobs. That is the goal of this tax
Of course,
reform.
James, what the media says in describing this is that it's just breaks for the rich. And in fact, you look at what happened during the Reagan administration from 83 to 89, when the tax cuts kicked in until the end of the Reagan administration. Yes, the rich increased their income by 12.2%, but look at the poorest. The poorest 20% also had a 12% gain.
Yeah, growth for everybody. Everybody's going to enjoy the growth. And I think the misconception is that people think that when you cut taxes on business, only the owners of the business benefit. And what we've learned is it's not just that a company has more money and it can pay out more wages, but when it can get a better return on investment, it invests more. So when a business expands, puts in new equipment, new machinery, that's what allows people to be more productive, and that's what allows them to get higher wages. So we've seen it in this country, all over the world. Lower business taxes, more productivity, people get paid more.
Kimberly, what kills me about the Democratic criticism of this is they say, oh, it's going to add to the debt. Where have they been for the past 8 years when our debt has grown from 10 trillion to 20 trillion? And that was by raising taxes, by the way. How dare they suggest or throw a stone at somebody else after what they've done?
You look at every single model out there, David, and it shows that the quickest way that you can deal with deficits and with debt is with a flourishing, growing economy. That is the way that you end up having massive amounts of tax revenue come back to the federal government when there are more people productively employed and more capital investment. And so, one of the things here that the Republicans are going to face as they deal with this is this criticism of deficit spending. And one thing that's notable and good this time around as you see Republicans pushing back on this and talking about the benefits of growth and the degree to which that growth could help pay for these tax cuts.
Yeah. Hey, Joe, that's a very important point because Gary Cohn is the president's chief economic advisor. A lot of people say he came from Goldman Sachs. He was a Democrat. They didn't know that he knew anything about what Dan described as supply side economics. But in fact, when he was pressed on it on Wednesday, he said this plan will pay for itself. We'll have enough growth, enough new economic activity, and enough elimination of those deductions and special deals. It will pay for itself. He didn't back down from that.
No, he didn't. And I think I give him credit for getting to this sort of supply side point. You know, a lot of people were skeptical. I think Gary Cohn is very sensitive about the tax cuts for the rich label. This is not a tax cuts for the rich bill. This is a growth bill. And he deserves a lot of credit for getting
James, will it pay for itself, this bill?
It will pay for a lot of the tax cuts, but we want to grow. And as we said, if you have a bigger economy, you can pay for more government. But just to underline, I think when a low or middle income person, besides the additional jobs, they're going to like what they see here, where the standard deduction is doubled. 10% bottom rate, right. And we won't have as many of these taxes where you're essentially forced to hire a tax preparer. Right. Simplicity means easy, cheap tax report filing, and so I think from that perspective they're going to like what they see.
Here's what simplicity means: it's all on a postcard. They could put it all on a postcard. Wouldn't that be nice after what we just went through with the tax season? When we come back, the Trump tax plan facing a lot of hurdles on Capitol Hill as Democrats, even some Republicans, are voicing opposition. So can the president get a deal? Inside the Beltway when we return.
This isn't going to be easy. Doing big things never is. We will be attacked from the left and we'll be attacked from the right. But one thing is certain. I would never, ever bet against this president. He will get this done for the American people.
Well, you're certainly going to be attacked from the left. This is the headline in the New York Times the day after it came out. Tax overhaul would aid wealthiest. That, of course, who we just saw was top White House economic advisor Gary Cohn, vowing this week that President Trump will get it done and push his tax cuts through Congress despite opposition from Democrats and even some Republicans. Now, Kim, how much does Washington and the nation's elite dislike what they heard this week?
Well, Democrats hated what they heard this week because every aspect of this, other than perhaps some corporate tax reform, are ideas that are anathema to them, as we were just discussing in the first segment. So he's going to get no help from Democrats whatsoever. And one thing that was interesting about this proposal, and I think a smart thing about that proposal, was the acknowledgement that they wasn't going to get any cooperation. The president had been under a lot of pressure to not do whole tax reform, holistic tax reform, just go on the corporate side, try to bring some Democrats over with an infrastructure deal. But there was no guarantee that they would actually go along with that. So what this bill was an acknowledgement that he's not going to get Democrat support. It was very much pitched at Republicans and Republican idea makers with the goal of getting this passed with Republican help.
But let me just stick with you for a second here, Kim, because some Republicans have also come out sounding like Democrats saying, oh, this is going to add to the debt, et cetera. How does Trump nail them down?
Look, I think that they're going to have to continue with this argument about the growth side of this bill, the importance of it simply from a substantive point of view. We are, as far as we are now, into a middling economic recovery. We saw those GDP numbers. If this doesn't get done, the Republicans risk owning a recession, which would be terrible. But he's got to make the political point to them as well, too, that especially in the aftermath of the problems with the health care bill, they have got to get a victory. And if there are some holdouts that on their own, as they did with health care, ruin this and stop the Republicans from a win, they could own the loss of their congressional majorities.
Well, Dan, it's not only the politicians, it's the swamp creatures, the lobbyists from K Street that are dead set against this because they've worked all their lives to get these special deductions. And now they're at risk. Even somebody who's not going to be hurt by this because they're going to keep the mortgage deductions. The Realtors Association came out against this bill, even though they continue to get what they've gotten before, a mortgage deduction.
Yeah. Well, as we sometimes say, it's early days. The plan was just announced this week. And, David, there's often a disconnect between the paid lobbyist in Washington whose reactions to something like this is knee-jerk and the people they actually represent out there in the country. And I suspect a lot of the industries that are being represented by these lobbyists are going to call up and say, wait a minute, this looks pretty good to us. I mean, every CEO you talk to and every business owner say, if you could drop the corporate tax rate or the taxes I pay on my business, we will invest in the economy.
Yeah.
And I think that message is going to penetrate even the Beltway over the next several months.
And James, if you give people a choice of what they have now, I mean, even the most simple tax forms are more complicated than a postcard. I mean, at least you have to do a couple of pages. Most of us who pay our taxes actually have to go in and hire somebody from H&R Block.
Yeah, I think the simplicity is going to be very exciting, very compelling, but also there is a big political winner if the White House can exploit it in this plan, and that is it says finally we're going to stop having people who live in low tax states essentially subsidized to the tune of $100 billion a year. People who live in places like this, in New York, in New Jersey, in California. This may be why the New York Times is so upset about this thing. The truth
Bingo.
is, Mr. Trump,
They're going to have to pay more in
is
taxes.
going after a big subsidy for essentially rich people in New York and other places. And this could be a real game changer, not just in terms of the federal tax code, but if you stop rewarding state governments for overtaxing, you might see some.
And Joe, you
discipline at the
stop
state level, too.
rewarding rich people who are getting their special cutaways. But what about the 45% of Americans who don't pay any federal income tax? I mean, that's a constituency that I would think the Democrats would be glomming onto right now to object to this bill.
Yeah, I mean, they do pay some taxes. I mean, they pay payroll taxes.
Well,
on
yeah,
their wages,
exactly. And state taxes.
You're right. They've moved off the income rolls. I don't think that's a particularly potent force to defeat this. It's much more the 90% of the state and local tax deduction flows to people who earn over $100,000 a year. Those are the real things,
Okay.
the real constituents.
I just want to get Kim in quickly before we go. Kim, what is the chance that the Trump team can steamroll over all this opposition?
I think he's got a better chance than with healthcare. This was something that a lot of Republicans wanted to go with first. Tax reform, there's a huge eagerness for it. He's got a better shot, a pretty good shot that he's going to get this.
Okay, last word from Washington.